Hello, this is Rob Payne with Volunteer Fairfax, and welcome to this special Volunteer Fairfax podcast. As one of the nation's largest volunteer centers, Volunteer Fairfax is building a better community through volunteer service. The center connects individuals, groups, and corporations to volunteer opportunities throughout the Washington metropolitan area. Hurricanes, tornadoes, floods, water boil warnings, power outages, even earthquakes. Are you prepared for these situations? Volunteer Fairfax wants to remind you to develop or review your household's emergency plans. An emergency can happen at any moment, and you do not want to be caught off guard without having a clear plan in place. Taking care of your family is one way to be prepared. However, you may need to be connected to organizations, businesses, and groups within the community that will want to be prepared too. To help us understand how to best prepare for emergencies in your home, today with me are Emily Swenson of Volunteer Fairfax and Matt Marquis from the Fairfax County Office of Emergency Management. Welcome, Emily and Matt.
Thanks, Rob.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Matt, I think I just right off the top want to establish what constitutes an emergency.
Well, you're really giving me a tough question right at the beginning. So, in my opinion, and a lot of people will debate about what emergencies are, but they could be anything from your natural disasters to your man-made disasters to everyday emergencies, whether that's a house fire, a power outage, you name it. An emergency basically limits the capabilities of a person, organization, family to have their day-to-day services, I guess would be the best way to say it. And any time that your social services and human services are limited, that constitutes an emergency in my eyes.
Now, how can individuals prepare for an emergency, and what resources are out there to help?
So some people might know that recently this month we actually released one of very few around the country. It's called the Community Emergency Response Guide. It's essentially the residents' counterpart to our Fairfax County Emergency Operations Plan. It dictates what people should do before, during, and after specific incidents, whether it's, like I said, a natural disaster, man-made disaster, or your everyday emergencies. It teaches people how to prepare for, to respond to, recover from, and mitigate against future emergencies. And it also allows people to create their own plans, whether it's an individual family emergency plan, whether it's a business or an organization continuity plan, or if you want to create a neighborhood plan and understand some of the intricacies in a neighborhood that you define. That's some of the resources that are available from Fairfax County.
Now, that just sounds like an incredible resource. How would one go about getting that?
So you can get it on our website, fairfaxcounty.gov/emergency management. There is a banner on the front page. It's essentially plastered all over the place. It's even on the fairfaxcounty.gov main page now. Go there, download it, take a look at it. Soon to come, it's also going to be available in multiple languages, to include Spanish, Arabic, Chinese, Vietnamese, and Korean. So,
for those of our listeners who might not be that internet savvy, there might be a way to get a printed version?
So there are printed versions available right now at the supervisors' offices and at the public libraries. We're working on some more printed copies.
Excellent.
So.
That sounds really great. Now, what emergencies should be planned for?
All of them.
All of them?
So in our realm, in our business, we use the all hazards approach, which essentially means that your plan for flooding should also be the same sort of plan for a tornado or a thunderstorm. Whether it doesn't really matter, because there are some of the same intricacies in both of them. A shelter in place is a response that a person can do on a day-to-day basis, whether it's an active shooter or it's a tornado. So when we say we want you to plan for all hazards, we want you to account for all the hazards that might affect you, and you can find out what hazards or risks are in your area. You can look it up on our webpage again, and look up the hazard mitigation plan, and that'll put up some of the more prevalent risks in the area. but you should plan for all of them equally and accordingly, and your plan should account for each one of those.
And really, anything is possible. I know I've lived here for a while. I went to high school here, so I'm dating myself. But in that time period, 2 tornadoes within a few miles of my house, and then most recently an earthquake on the natural disaster. Things that you wouldn't necessarily expect to be in Fairfax County, Virginia, but they do happen, don't they?
Right, absolutely. And, you know, I actually went to high school here too, and I might be dating myself a little bit at this point, but yeah, we've had terrorism incidents, and we also have incidents like hazardous materials incidents that you rarely hear about unless they become very big news. So it's one of those things where we want you to prepare for all of those.
Now, how often should an emergency kit, emergency plan be updated for an individual or family or business?
Well, I can't tell anyone to do it. I suggest when you change the clocks, it's an easy way to remember. We normally say every 6 months, and until recently I found out that our daylight savings time is only 4 months, so we would be doing it for 4 months and then 8 months afterwards. But 6 months is a great way to look at it. We always talk about, with planning, the last time you want to execute a plan is when you absolutely need it. So you should be looking at your plan all the time, and when you're doing that, you should be exercising the plan, because the last thing you want to have happen is for you to pull it off the shelf and be like, all right, so what do we do in this situation? And the situation's already unfolding. So you planning and exercising the plans is incredibly important, because you can find the gaps and the things that you need to fill in and maybe update at the same time. So,
and that's for, in a family, especially people of all ages,
right.
Not just the parents, but the children.
Absolutely.
Elderly, if you happen to have seniors, you know, older people living with you, you got to make sure everybody's on board with that. Would that be correct?
Absolutely. And it's with organizations, it can be a little bit of a tricky thing, because, you know, people work, people got other plans, people got all this, but I implore people who make decisions to do them, even if it's a monthly fire drill. That's essentially planning your emergency plan and executing and training on that. So
now, let's say, I know you all recently had a tornado drill. I believe it was last week in Fairfax County. Let's just say a tornado or some type of natural disaster takes place that affects your community or the entire community. What is the best way to stay informed once a disaster is actually taking place or has just taken place?
So I'm always going to push our local free public information warning system, Fairfax Alerts. If you're a Fairfax County resident, you can sign up through fairfaxcounty.gov/alerts. But in this day and age, technology is a great thing to leverage. Social media, for all of its pitfalls, will give you some pretty prevalent information in the time of disaster, and it is able to meticulate pretty quickly, and people are able to get it really fast. So I would say Fairfax Alerts, definitely, but also to understand what your communication capabilities are in there, because you trying to call someone, for example, after the earthquake, everyone was trying to make a phone call. You couldn't make the phone calls go through because everyone had the same idea, right? In those situations, my suggestion is to text, because there's a better chance of it getting through the cell towers to a person that you're trying to connect to. But there are little tips and tricks that you can get as far as communicating during a disaster. But to stay informed, use the internet, use your local media, and sign up for your local alerting system, in this case Fairfax Alerts.
That's great. And even if, I know my big concern is when we lost power for several days, I think it was last year, including our office, and when all your phones go out and you don't have power, there's still crank radios and there's still crank flashlights, and sometimes those might be a way to keep in contact too, and to make sure your phones are always charged. Emily, how is Volunteer Fairfax involved in emergency response in Fairfax County?
Yeah, so Volunteer Fairfax has been involved for many years. Soon after September 11th, we got involved when the county created the Citizen Corps Council. So we began, just like in some of the larger areas that have disasters on a regular basis, such as Florida with hurricanes, they're always using volunteers to be able to get themselves back to a resilient state and get their community up and going. So Volunteer Fairfax really looked at how we could utilize and mobilize spontaneous volunteers, so people who once a disaster's happened, have decided they want to come out and do something for their neighbors. So that's where Volunteer Fairfax came in, and we have a whole volunteer reception center plan that if there is, say, a flood or a tornado or something like that, we actually have a seat in the Emergency Operations Center. We're under the Volunteer Donations Management Plan. And under that, if there is a need for spontaneous volunteers, we would stand up a volunteer reception center, and it could be virtual or it could be physical depending on what the situation is. And then volunteers who are not pre-affiliated, so they haven't joined the Red Cross, they haven't joined the Salvation Army or what have you, could come out and help with whatever needs there are in the community. So we've been involved with that for quite some time.
Now, how might one get involved if an emergency occurs? If, let's say, there's a tornado and somebody says, "Okay, I want to help." Now, there are good ways to do that, and sometimes not so good ways to do that, right? What is the correct way to get involved to support your community?
I think like Matt was talking about, making sure that we're planning ahead so that people are able to take care of themselves if a disaster were to happen, and helping their neighbors in their local community. They actually can join CERT, which stands for Citizen Emergency Response Team, so they can pre-train themselves so that they can be helpful in their neighborhoods. What we ask people is not self-deploy, wait for a message that there's a need for volunteers. And that would be made through all of the public service announcements. So it would come across your TV stations. If you're signed up for Fairfax Alerts, you would be hearing about it through that. It would be a message that would be specific in how they could respond, because we don't want individuals to self-deploy and then create more of a disaster situation than is already happening.
Would you say that along those lines, that when there is a disaster, that the majority of volunteers that are active and useful are the ones that have been pre-trained, or is there ever a case where somebody can just step up at the last minute without any training and say, "I'm here"? It really requires that pre-training.
I would say both are beneficial. I think that the pre-trained and pre-affiliated volunteers serve lots of purposes. There are individuals there's something called the Voluntary Organizations Active in Disasters. All of those are pre-trained networks of individuals who go out and respond. So it could be a pilot with a plane who's going to help with flights that are needed. It could be individuals with four-wheel drive vehicles that are pre-trained. They're going to go out and help to get people from point A to point B. Oftentimes when there's a disaster that calls for spontaneous volunteers, there's a need for manpower and labor. For instance, in the Fairfax County community, after some of the hurricanes and after there was flooding in the Huntington area, we needed volunteers to come out and muck out basements so that individuals could get back and get in their homes and get back to a state of normal. So those volunteers, while not pre-affiliated or trained, they had the wherewithal to come out and help their neighbors, and we made use of them as well during that situation.
And if I recall, we discussed this once a while back. That was one of the times where you did have an off-site volunteer coordination center. That I think when people think about volunteering, especially in these more physically demanding situations, they think they've got to be out there in the rain, they've got to be out there in the mud. But for I also work with the RSVP program with some slightly older volunteers. And there are places for them, too, where they can be in some of these off-site areas. Is that correct?
Of course, and we're always looking at safety. We don't want to put anybody in harm's way, so we're making sure that whatever situation that we're putting volunteers into is a safe situation, and there's a process and a plan for how they're going in. There may be equipment that they're going to wear. For instance, in that mucking out of basements, people had suits on so that they weren't exposed to some of the hazards that were happening because of that flooding. They process in, we process them out, we make sure nobody's left behind. And so there's a whole process to make sure that it's a safe situation to use those volunteers.
And like every other organization or nonprofit or agency that Volunteer Fairfax supports, these volunteers make a big difference. I mean, again, I think everybody lives in Fairfax County and they think we have the best emergency people in the world. I mean, they're sent to earthquakes all over the world. But despite that, when something like this happens, there're just not enough people, and you need qualified, trained volunteers to step forward and do this, or else there are going to be people hurting. Is that
right? We say that within the first 72 hours after a disaster, that the government, the police, the fire are responding to that disaster. They're trying to help with the highest priority needs. So the individuals who are within our community, they need to be able to be planned and have their emergency kits so that they can stay put, they can keep themselves going, so that they're not adding to that emergency. One of the things that, while Volunteer Fairfax has been involved in the emergency response field, that came to fruition is something called our community resiliency groups. We really found that it wasn't just the individual that needed to be prepared and planned, but that the organizations, the faith communities, homeowners association, nonprofits, government agencies, if we could get those organizations prepared themselves and then also networked so that if in a disaster they could rely and be resources for one another, that the whole process could be even stronger within our community. And those are the community resiliency groups, or CRGs. So that's something for the past 5 years that Fairfax County Office of Emergency Management and Volunteer Fairfax and Neighborhood and Community Services with Fairfax County, as well as some of those faith communities and homeowners communities have been putting together.
Now, before we want Matt's going to talk a little bit more about community resilience groups. Before we switch over there, is there any other things that Volunteer Fairfax does as far as planning ahead for emergencies, trainings, etc.?
Yeah, we have something called our volunteer emergency team. So these are individuals who are interested in being pre-affiliated with Volunteer Fairfax ahead of emergency, and we do training with them so that they can help to be our staff at those volunteer reception centers and help to make it so that our staff of 14 can be even more and greater, because in a disaster situation we're going to need more individuals. So that volunteer emergency team is a way for an average citizen to become involved with the volunteer coordination efforts.
And when people think about volunteering and doing this type of training work, what type of time are we talking about when someone sits out and says, I want to be part of CERT? And I realize it's different levels. I want to be part of CERT. I want to be on the VET. What type of time commitment are they looking at?
It all depends, but I would say that there's quite a bit of training involved. For the vet, it's about 16 hours of training in the first year that you're in the program. For CERT, I might turn to Matt.
I want to say it's 24 to 40 hours total of training, and that's just the basic training. And they, like we were just saying, there's multiple levels. So you can get trained up all the way to be, very prevalent in the incident command structure that's brought to you by NIMS, the National Incident Management System. You could just get the basic training and say, hey, I'm good, and that's all I need. But they offer a lot of different avenues to include ham radio, so your amateur radio, your Skywarn programs, weather-related programs, basic search and rescues, stuff along those lines. So it's really, really endless as far as those.
And the training is, for volunteers, the training is free.
Free, absolutely.
And it's held in convenient places.
And there's the medical reserve corps, so if you have a certification as a doctor or a nurse, there are ways to use that skill in times of disaster. Yeah, there's lots of training, and it's all over our community. There's the Citizen Corps Council website, which has a lot of that information about the various organizations.
Now, Matt, now that Fairfax County is leading the CRG, the Community Resilience Group program, can you tell us a little bit more about how you all have it structured?
So, the way it's structured is, it's Fairfax County Office of Emergency Management's program. Like Emily was saying earlier, we work in conjunction with Volunteer Fairfax, Neighborhood and Community Services. We are just now bringing on partners from the police department, from the fire department, the area of aging.
Area Agency on Aging.
Yeah, Area Agency on Aging. AAA is how I know. And we are also bringing in other public safety partners from the Sheriff's Office and from the Department of Public Safety Communications. But it's also very much volunteer driven. Most of the people that make up the council or the Community Resiliency Group Steering Committee are volunteers. And the way it's structured is in the event of a disaster, volunteer and donations management, the annex would be activated, and the group supervisor in the Emergency Operations Center would report to the EOC or be virtually. We would do a needs assessment and essentially send out a information blast, if you will, to our volunteer district representatives, and there potentially will be 9. Currently we have 6. It's very hard to get people to step up for that because it does require a lot of energy and a lot of time. But the fact is they will get information about what the needs are going to be or about the event itself and what the needs might be, and to alert the organizations that are aligned with them. So we kind of touched on it a little bit, but it could be anything from a homeowners association, civic association, house of worship, volunteer group, community-based organization, faith-based organization, small business. Any of these different types of sectors, we are looking for them. We want to get them networked, because we have this saying in emergency management is that any disaster starts and ends at the local level, regardless of what it is. If it's a Category 5 hurricane, it comes in and does devastation. The local government are the first responders. We have to apply for statewide mutual aid, then we have to apply for federal assistance. But at some point, the federal government and the statewide government, they're going to leave, and it's going to ultimately come back to the locals. And like Emily was stating beforehand, we want to get these groups together so that we can build this resilient community right here, that people in these organizations will take the helm and kind of recover themselves. And the onus will not necessarily be on the government anymore, but it'll be a joint partnership between the community, the government, and all the other sectors that make up Fairfax County. So as far as structure is concerned, there are 9 supervisory districts. We want people to be involved in their supervisory district. There will be a individual who is a volunteer, who will be the district representative, who will essentially be the person that they report to. We also are really trying to get involvement from the supervisors' offices, and we've had success with a few. We're still working on a couple others. But ultimately, at the end of the day, in an emergency operation, it comes down from volunteer and donations management to the volunteer district reps, to their organizations, and then that information gets flowed back up also at the same time.
So the volunteers and just the citizens really play a major role, not just in the time they put in, but in the management to some extent.
Yes.
If a disaster were to take place.
Yes.
And just in a general sense, what and I think you touched on some of these, but just again to reiterate, what are the benefits of being a part of the Community Resilience Group program?
Well, I think the biggest benefit, and this might just be me, but is the networking with like-minded individuals. And in VOAD, we kind of talked about a little bit, volunteer organizations active in disaster. Those organizations have disaster recovery and response as their mission, or one of their many missions. These organizations may not necessarily have that, but want to help. So having that communication structure and that ability to network with, maybe the mosque down the street or the homeowners association across the street is great, because it builds the neighbor-to-neighbor relationship, and it also strengthens the resiliency at the same time. But some of the benefits that we offer from the county perspective is we will open you up to a litany of different trainings. We've already remarked about CERT, MRC. We haven't talked about the Until Help Arrives program, which will encompass Stop the Bleed campaign. It will also encompass active shooter training. We will do a lot of different things and try to open people up to this huge array of trainings that are offered in Fairfax County that people may not necessarily know about it. So on an individual level, they can get more prepared and bring it back to their organization to ultimately get their organization more prepared.
And I would say it's community building, because being a part of this, Fairfax County can seem so large, but when you're a part of this, you see the people and you connect with the people in the community. I think you also see the good in people. You see that people are willing to give, that organizations, not just faith communities, but businesses and the local organization down the street, they want to help. They want to be a part of it. So it's great community building.
And Emily, just to follow up on that from a volunteer perspective, it's something we talk about all the time in the volunteer discussions is, what do I get out of it? What does a volunteer get out of it at the end of the day?
Yeah, I think it's that network building. People look for different things. I think the training's great. I think it provides leadership opportunities for people who are looking for a way to step up in their community and be a part at a larger level. If you're looking to build your sense of neighborhood and community, this is a great way to do it. There are a lot of different possible benefits that somebody can get.
And I'll also say emergency management is still relatively new as far as a concept in the United States and around the world, but it's starting to pick up a lot of steam. And for those people who may be, not necessarily saying they will be, but if they wanted to do a career change and all that stuff, understanding the principles and the guidelines that emergency management follows, there are applications for just about any business, any sector, any job that you may or may not do. So that's just another benefit of learning about emergency management and how that impacts everyone's day-to-day life.
And just to stress again, like both of y'all were saying, I think when a disaster takes place, people look to the very highest place, whether it be FEMA or whatever, the Red Cross, but it really goes down, not even to beyond a county level, but down to a community level, a street level in some cases. If everybody is working together and they're prepared and they're out there ready to go, it can save lives, and a lot of lives.
Absolutely.
A lot of lives.
And I mean, some of the discussions that have come up in previous CRG meetings, you talked about technology as being a great resource, but it also can be a handicap when you don't have it. And that's been part of our discussions of what happens when we don't have technology. How are we going to communicate that this is where the resources are, this is where the need is most? And so you're a part of that conversation, that you're maybe quelling your anxiety of what's going to happen if something were to unexpectedly happen in your community.
Now, after folks have listened to this podcast, the next step is, how do you get involved? Number one, you can share this podcast with everybody you know, so they can hear these great pieces of advice from Emily and Matt. But I want to ask each of you to get more involved and to support this movement. Who should they contact? What website should they visit? What phone number should they call?
So I'm going to say just go to Volunteer Fairfax's website, because it is an absolute mouthful with our website. If you want to go ahead, it's our fairfaxcounty.gov/emergency management/community-resiliency-groups. So if you wanted to do it that way, by all means, but it's easier to just go to volunteerfairfax.org, and you can figure it out from there.
Yep, and we have an emergency page with lots of the links to resources that we talked about today.
Right. That's wonderful. Yeah. Well, thank you again, Matt and Emily, for being here today. And again, just for more information on Volunteer Fairfax Emergency Response Program, please visit www.volunteerfairfax.org. If there's anything we'd like you to come away from this podcast with today, is please take the time to prepare yourself and your household. Please look into your local area disaster plan. Every little bit can help, and that can change the outcome during an emergency. So thank you again, Matt and Emily, for being here. We really appreciate your time and your expertise and everything you all do. This is Rob Payne from Volunteer Fairfax, and thanks for joining us today, and have a great day.